Hey there, gang. Patrick King here, and I want to thank you for tuning in for episode number 28 of Talking About Horses. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by horseman, and most specifically, Classical California Bridle Horseman, Bruce Sandifer. Bruce, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. I've been looking forward to connecting with you for several years now, actually. We've kind of crossed some paths through social media, and it's always been great to see the posts and listen to what you've got going on. For the folks out here listening that maybe don't know who you are or aren't familiar with you and what you do, can you give us a little bit your background, your biography? How'd you get your start with horses?
Well, I started out as a ranch cowboy, and I did that for about 25 years, big outfit ranch cowboy and buckaroo all over the country, from Canada to Texas, basically. Working on different ranches, mostly big outfits. And, from there, I went on to starting a lot of colts in the performance horse industry, mainly rein cow horses and reiners, and showing a little bit. And when I came back down to California, I got really deep into the traditional California bridle horse thing, and that's what kind of set me on this path here for the last 15 years or so.
Wow. Okay, so talk to me maybe about the what is this path? We talk about the Classical Californio Bridle Horse. What does that mean? What is that?
Well, for us, it is, the Spanish California type from the end of the mission period through the Rancho period. And basically, these are horses that are started in a hackamore and then brought into a two-rein, which is a small hackamore and a bridle, and then ending up straight up in a bridle. And bridle horse in this, or in my opinion, in this style, is a spade bit horse. And, the horses are started at 4 years old. They never have a bit in their mouth until the teeth are fully set. A lot of the modern ray cow horse, more modern California style is snaffle bit, hackamore, two-rein, bridle. We don't do the snaffle bit section.
Mm-hmm.
We start a horse a little bit older. And, a little bit more early California traditional. And one of the reasons for that is that's the way I grew up, starting them in the snaffle and going to a hackamore and then the two-rein and that. And after a while, it became, I didn't see the point of the snaffle bit process unless you're starting 2-year-olds. Because a hackamore horse won't ride, you can't ride it for 3 years in a hackamore and have a very responsive horse by the time you go into the two-rein. And so I think that was one of the reasons for the snaffle bit addition, plus the futurity aspect of most people showing in young horses and futurity things, and we don't do that.
Right.
We have an association where we do show a little bit, but nothing can be shown until it's 4 years old, and it's just hackamore, two-rein bridle.
Okay. So you said, did I hear you right? You said you really can't ride a horse in a hackamore for 3 years and keep him light for in the two-rein?
Well, I don't think they're going to be, when you want to switch into a two-rein on your hackamore horse, mm-hmm. is when that horse is at the peak of its performance. And so once you go, you can keep them fairly light for 3 years. I mean, but you have to be real careful. But if you're working a lot of cattle and stuff, they're going to figure out that it's just a piece of leather on their nose.
Ah, just a bluff, yeah.
Yeah, and it's, people say it's a bluff, but really, in the traditional system, it's more of a balance point. And so,
okay.
The hackamore is the most important stage, in my opinion, in that, we start our horses in a pretty soft hackamore, because that's the time when you might be pulling on them. Horses are going to spook and they're going to do colt things. And, but we teach them where to put their feet, how to use their feet with a human on their back, how to start collecting and using the hind end. This is very, horses really have to work through their hocks in this style, because it is a cow horse style. We do a lot of roping and a lot of cow work. And so all of that's done in the hackamore. The horse is basically fully trained in the hackamore. He'll learn to work off the balance of your seat and the change of balance in the hackamore, and he can get really light. What happens is, with speed and roping and stuff, the horse will kind of learn that he can push into the hackamore. And so riding one for 3-4 years in one, they're going to figure that out.
So there's just more room for error on the rider's part at that point, is what you mean?
I think so.
Okay.
It just depends on what you're doing, and I think it's like everything. It's your specific situation. We use our horses. We gather cattle in pretty rough country and stuff. So I found that it's hard for me to keep one really at that. When I want to go into the 2 rein is when that horse is really, really at its lightest, at its finest point. I don't want to go to the bridle because the hackamore quit working.
Yeah.
So to speak. And so that's just, my take on it. I'm sure people out there that are doing things can get that done. But for me, besides that, I like to be in the hackamore about a year and a half, and then go into that bridle as that horse's mouth is fully set. So he's not teething at all. His mouth is set. And so I don't like to put anything in their mouth until their mouth is set. So if I start them at 4 and I go a year and a half, that kind of puts me in that right range there for going into a bridle. Gotcha.
Okay. I've heard a line. I don't even recall where I've heard it, but I've heard it I think several times. That a lot of old bridle horse fellas wouldn't put a bit in the horse's mouth until what they referred to as the horse's chest popped. And the way that I understand that is that the horse has, as you talked about, kind of started collecting, learned to use his haunches, and he's starting to elevate then in the thoracic sling,
right,
which is giving him better development and opportunity for mobility and movement and a more uphill carriage. Is that kind of how you think about it?
Absolutely. And that's a big, important part that I think the traditional California system is a little bit different, is that we are really collection driven. A lot of Western horses, they don't really collect up that much. Mm-hmm. But these type of horses, more of a classical background. The Spanish California, they were all classically trained either in the military or the parishes. And so there's a lot more of that. We like to see our horses upright. And it's a balance system. Everything has a strong neutral position and works on a balance. And change of balance is a signal. Return to balance is the reward. And so if a horse isn't elevated enough, he's not going to carry that bridle in a position where the balance can work. If that makes any sense. Okay. He has to have that elevation in his neck and arch and that uphill carriage.
Okay. Now, you touched on a point that I'm really glad that you mentioned, and that was about a lot of Western horses not necessarily collecting up, so to speak. When you're talking about collection, can you tell me what you're looking for? How would you define collection?
Well, for me, it's the horse is engaging the underside and stretching the top line of his body, and so that he's reaching further with his hind legs, and he's putting more weight. He's carrying more weight on his hind. We're very big into a horse actually driving from behind and working from behind, where many horses now kind of work off their front ends And like cutting horses, and specifically, a lot of the cow horses, they push off that front,
Moving sort of like a wedge, yeah?
What's that?
They kind of sweep back and forth, but they move sort of like a wedge, very downhill.
Yeah, they're down and they're pushing off with that front end. Well, that's fine if you're in the sand, but on real grass conditions and stuff, those horses will fall down.
Yeah.
On steep hills and stuff like that. So we need a horse that works off its hind end and lifts its front legs and rotates around. They're going to push off, but they don't have that low sweep in the front end.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And we do a lot of roping too. So, if a horse goes down like that when it's working a cow and you rope something, you saddle slide that it's just a different type of horse.
Right. Right.
It's gotten very specialized, a lot of Western riding. Where this system is, the horse needs to do everything pretty well. Needs to travel around the country good. He needs to be able to rope and work a cow, and work 100 cows, not just one.
Yeah, gotcha. So would you say that you'd be able to use or not maybe one of those sort of modern specialized horses for the rein cow horse or the reining or the cutting that are kind of built like a downhill wedge? Is that a horse that we would say maybe would not be suitable for this type of riding?
No, those aren't. I've done a lot of quarter horses and a lot of different. We ride, generally in my workshops, I ride a couple of 300 to 400 horses a year. And they're all kind of fun. And every horse can collect up. And I think some horses are just more naturally built that way. The Spanish horses, I tend to favor the Spanish horses because basically they've got a bridle horse build, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel to get it, so to speak. They're kind of set up that way. Right.
Yeah, a lot of those Spanish bred, Spanish type horses kind of come out of the womb collected.
Yeah, I mean they're born for balance, and so and they're real uncomfortable if they're out of balance. And so the system seems to work very well, But I've done a lot of quarter horses and stuff like that. It's just that I feel it takes a little more time to develop the collection. You really have to do,
Uh-oh, are you there? Can you hear me? Uh-oh, we seem to have lost him. Uh-oh. I'll call him back. Gosh, I hate when that happens.
Lost you there.
Yeah, lost you. Sorry about that. I hate when that happens.
Yeah. So I don't know where I was at.
So we were talking about it takes a little bit more time with the quarter horses that you see in your workshops to kind of get them.
Horses are generally built, whether they be quarter horses or whatever, that is built a little downhill. Tend to be downhill. It takes a lot more time to build that collection up. Some are, it's kind of specific to that horse. And it has to be built just like any other form of collection, classical collections built through lateral movements and things like that, exercises. And I don't think, that's one thing that I think a lot of cowboy horses are missing. When you just go out and trot big miles, you don't really spend a lot of time gathering the horse up.
Yeah, gotcha. Absolutely. So you talk a lot, Bruce, about balance and about how this kind of horsemanship comes from a place of balance. And you mentioned the balance is the reward when the horse gets back into the balance if they've lost it or when they come to it in the first place. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What are you meaning when you talk about balance?
Well, each piece of equipment in this system has a point where it hangs in balance, and there's like a sweet spot. And if the horse carries itself in this place, nothing hits it. It just hangs off the headstall. the bridle or the hackamore. We use a feedor on ours, and it balances that spot. And when they put their head in that spot, nothing touches them, basically. And what we try to do is incorporate that same thing in our seat. We have a point in the center of our seat where we're not behind or ahead of the movement. We're in the center of the movement as close as we can. When we adjust that balance by sitting down or lifting up, it changes that balance. The horse will find that and we return to that neutral position, what we call the neutral position, and the horse is rewarded. And so instead of a horse trying to get away from you, like from a spur or from pressure, the horse follows the feel that you give it, opening a door somewhere, and then returning to neutral is the reward for that. So they're kind of always searching for your center. And we like to say we ride them through their spine to our spine. And so everything is done, so that we can ride them with one hand and be very effective and yet not lose all your lateral flexion in the process.
Okay. So we might in the dressage world talk then about that horse being between the aids or on the aids.
Yeah, I mean,
or maybe with the aids. I think maybe would be. I prefer to use the term with the aids rather than on.
And that would be, like say from a dressage standpoint, you would ride in a light contact, right?
Yes.
Right. So they're supposed to be on the bit, and the bits in the California system, a very good spade bit, is built with that same balance point so that the weight of the bit and the weight of the range creates a light contact. But it's not it's an indirect light contact. It's not something you have to hold in your hand. If that makes any sense. It's created through a mechanical force. And what that does is allows you to be a lot, instead of having to have that horse gathered all the time, you can just gather him when he needs to work and then let him go because you ride maybe 10, 11 hours of the day or you're riding a lot of country. So that horse needs to be able to relax in between those gathered moments.
Gotcha. Okay. So then you talked about the weight and the balance creating the contact, and sort of what comes to mind for me is maybe a rock on a string, or even sort of maybe a yo-yo, where you can work that because of the line and because of the way that it's working, the contact has remained without hanging on it or holding on to it necessarily.
Right. Yeah, you don't have to engage it with your hand to have that balance work. But the equipment, it's always seeking that balance point itself. And so it's always telling that horse, and that's why it takes a little bit longer to bit a horse in a spade bit. And that's why we use the two-rein process. He knows how to balance and find the balance of the hackamore. So we use the two-rein. And sometimes for a couple of years, we use them. And, we'll start for several months and never touch the bridle reins. We just show them where the balance point of that bit is. And then when we change the balance in the hackamore, the two-rein hackamore, it'll change the balance in that bit, and they'll start to understand that going from around the nose to in the mouth. And one of the things that people ask me all the time, well, if the horse is so good in the hackamore, why do you go to a bit?
Mm-hmm.
And the bit is not to create a bunch of force. All it is it's like an amplifier of the signal. So I can use a smaller signal, move my hand way less, and still get the same amount of signal through the bridle. And it also has, a little bit of enforcement to it because it is a curb bit. It's one that's very, very slow to engage the pressure from the curb strap or the pressure on the bar of the mouth. So there's a ton of signal to it, but it's there, and it's kind of like a cop being by the side of the road. If he's parked there, you're going to slow down. And so the horse starts to understand that, just having that in his mouth will kind of tell him, pay attention, don't push into things. So that's the reason we go into a bridle. Plus, you can use a lot smaller movement. When you get to roping, we pack 60 foot of rope, and there's one thing to be very, if you're in an arena and you're riding around on good ground and you have the ability to ride very correctly, that's all great. But when you've got 60 foot of rope and maybe a wild cow rope and you're on a side hill, that horse needs to be able to protect himself. And so the spade bit is actually designed so the horse can take a hold of it and protect himself when you can't.
How do you mean protect himself?
Well, with the braces, the way they are, he can stop the rotation of the bit. The bit doesn't engage any pressure until it rotates enough for the curb strap to engage and the bar, the cannon bar to come in contact with his bars.
Mm-hmm.
So what he'll do is because of the height of the spoon and the braces, it gives a wider point there. He can use his lips and his mouth to hold that bit from rotating. And so the whole system is built to protect the horse's mouth, every aspect of it, from the hackable training up into the spade bit. And that's where people have a big misconception, because the spade bit's kind of a big bit,
mm-hmm.
and they just don't understand the mechanics of it. There are things that you can't do. You can't split your reins in a spade bit and pull out to the side.
Right.
Because the mouthpiece sticks up into, just past the first premolar, actually. It's not very high in a horse's mouth. There's about 8 inches above that before you get to their back molars.
Mm-hmm.
But if you grab it by one hand and pull out to the side, you're going to tip that in there and possibly nick a gum.
Oh, yeah.
Because it is in between the two sets of teeth.
Mm-hmm.
But that straight on, it's way less severe than most, even pelhams that you have that have the same amount of leverage, because it just has so much more surface to distribute any pressure that is applied.
Gotcha. So it's a surface area game.
Yeah.
Similar to, like, if we were, I don't know, when I do bidding lectures, I have a spade bit that I carry around, and people always get the, oh gosh, that's awful, and I have them do a little exercise where they'll just push one finger on their thigh versus pushing 4 fingers on their thigh, and they realize that the greater surface area is actually easier to bear in that sense.
Yeah, I just, you whip out your knife and say, which end do you want to cut, the thick one or the skinny one, I mean,
yeah.
It's the same thing, the pressure applied over a smaller area is going to create more pain than pressure applied over a larger area. And that's just, that's mechanical fact.
Right, exactly. That's the physics behind it. So one thing that I've noticed, maybe you can talk about this a little bit, is I see very little and often no what we would refer to as tongue relief in the bars of the spade bit. And of course, relief being sort of a misnomer to a lot of folks, thinking that it's a good thing, but I always refer to relief as something from like a topographical term in a map, the relief being just a change in elevation. That becomes basically a place for the tongue to jam, so that the bars of the mouth are what gets encountered primarily by the bars of the bit, and we don't see that, or at least I don't see that. I don't know, in the spade bit. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, the spade bit, being a protection bit, it doesn't have that place where if you apply pressure, the tongue squeezes up into that gap to allow them to put more pressure on the bars, the gums of the horse. It doesn't have that. The tongue is super strong on a horse. I mean, if anybody that's ever warmed one or done any teeth work knows how strong. I mean, it's one of the strongest muscles in their body, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can protect themselves a lot with their tongue. You know, they can do a lot with that. You know, if I watch them, we were out gathering today, you know, my horse is eating the tops of thistles. You know, they're pretty tough.
Right.
So, you know, that, I think that is one of those things, you know, when we talk about relieving tongue relief, it is a misnomer. I think it's not actually true. I think it's one of those things that it's just not helping the horse that much.
Right. It sure sounds good, though.
A lot of people that think that, you know, I think spade bit's got kind of a bad rap. People put them on horses like to stop them or something.
Mm-hmm.
What you find out pretty quickly is that they're really a terrible leverage bit. They're an excellent signal bit, but they're really not a good leverage bit. If they were great leverage bits, wouldn't they be using them still in rink out horse and reining? You know, it's just not true. They're just not very good to pull on. And the whole thing is, you want to use just little motions with it, just little jiggles for signal. And that's what it's for. It's a great signaling bit. It communicates a lot about direction and things with the pieces that it has, the braces and so on. And it also, I believe, helps stretch your top line a little bit. Having that mouthpiece work up a little bit higher into the palate, when it's set in a place, that horse will tend to stretch those last three vertebrae on the poll, and that's one of the you know, things that you see that is kind of the mark of a great bridle horse, is that he will be a little bit stretchier in that area.
Okay.
A swan neck.
A swan neck. Gotcha. More reaching through the top line to the bit then.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm thinking what you said about the kind of using the small movements and the horse picking up on those. And if the horse is carrying himself in the right position, or if the bit is balanced in the right position based on the horse's conformation or anatomy or whatever, I'm thinking in my mind from the anatomical perspective, those smaller signals are going to help the horse to stay more relaxed through the tongue and through the top line. And then, as you said, kind of the being a protective sort of a bit, if we have to take a hold of it for whatever reason, or if the horse bears onto it, that would do less detriment maybe to those sensitive tongue muscles and even to the hyoid itself. And we know that if there's tension in the horse's tongue, then there's going to be tension through the top line and through the scapula and through the sternum and all of those other places. So having the horse educated to work off of that signal of the bit, off of the gentle kind of rocking and swaying, is going to keep the jaw more mobile and the tongue softer, yeah?
Yeah, I believe it does. I think, you know, it's really, you know, I do a demonstration with a skull, and it's set up with a tongue and everything in it. And, you know, once people see how it fits in the mouth, it's pretty ingenious. You know, that's what really keeps me excited about teaching it, and is, you know, it's a really scientific system. It's very passive. It's not a forceful system. And horses, the guys that designed this rode horses a lot and did a lot of things with them. And, you know, they were historically, you know, really, really great horses. And, you know, the horse can learn to work just really quickly and work through himself really well and engage the hind end, but do incredibly fast turns and stops. And you can do it without moving your hand hardly at all. You know, because generally the horses, once you know, synchronize your seat balance point to that bit balance point, everything works together and it's very seamless. And I always say, you know, when I'm really on my game and my horse is with me, you shouldn't be able to see anything happen. There should be no visible signal. You know, it's a secret between him and I.
Yes.
What we're talking about.
Yes.
And, you know, and that's, you know, that's why I keep doing it.
That's awesome. And arguably the same could be said for all good riding.
I think absolutely. You know, it's like people who want to compare this or that. And it's, you know, yes, they're very. I think all great riding is you know, based off the seat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what you're doing. You know, if you're thinking that a bit or a piece of equipment is going to enhance or detract from what you're doing, then I think there's something missing in the rest of your riding.
Yeah.
You know, because there's no, as anybody that's been around very much, there's no bit in the world that's going to make something happen. There's things that work consistently with the rest of the way you ride, and can help people, you know, achieve maybe a little more consistency. But, you know, none of that's going to create any of that. Good riding, good planning, you know, good exercise, good drills, and just a good relationship with your horse is going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the coolest thing I think about this system is that it was developed, you know, and I don't know, it's different than other Spanish colonial systems. Okay, you can look at Mexico or Brazil or Argentina. Those are all Spanish colonies about the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But only here did it really develop the way it did into this balance system. And it's also set up, it works like a horse works a horse. You know, it doesn't get ahead of the horse and lead it somewhere. It kind of opens the door and then herds them through. And that's the way this system kind of works. And so you won't see people leading a horse from their back doing this kind of riding or getting ahead of the horse in any way.
Gotcha.
And that's why we're so good on cattle.
Okay.
Because the horses have to be the closest thing to the cow, not the person, you know.
Yeah. So it works the similar balance then.
Get ahead of them. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you said a minute or so ago something about you mentioned the guys that designed this system. Tell me about that. What do we know about the history of the California bridle horses?
Well, if we look, you know, the Padres brought up the cattle. Those and the first soldiers came into California. Most of the Padres were pretty classically trained. You know, the church actually ran the horse herd in Spain. They were in charge of breeding the horses. And these guys, you know, they came up, you know, into basically wilderness and set up their mission system. But what's different about California, or I believe it is, and this is my take on it, and what I've read and stuff. I think everywhere else where they established the mission system up through New Mexico and Texas and all that country that was, and Mexico, the Indians were more warlike. When they got over here to this coast, a lot of the Chumash and Catalino Indians were very kind of passive, friendly type Indians or indigenous people. And they started putting them on horseback even when it was against the law. It was punishable by death for indigenous people to be a horseback in Spanish ruled, you know, the frontier. And so they started, because the herds did so well here on the mild climate and stuff, they started putting these kids that had herded them afoot, you know, the sheep and the cattle afoot, and started putting them on horseback. And they developed these families of either Spanish and indigenous people mixed into these vaqueros. And these vaqueros were, you know, phenomenal riders and horsemen. And I think that indigenous aspect, you know, hunter-gatherer, studying animals the way they work, I think that brought more to this system than anything else. That's just my opinion. Just because it is so natural to horses. I mean, we ride a lot of horses that weren't started in this system, in our workshops and stuff, and they'll come into this in about 10 minutes. They'll just figure it out. They'll go, yeah, that's right. And they'll just start doing it, and it doesn't take a lot of training or drills or anything else. Horses like balance. And they can find balance in a system. They really come into it and remain a lot happier.
Oh, and like you said, the balance itself becomes the reward. So then the horse would learn. And I should be phrasing this as a question. Do you find that the horse learns then that they have a semblance of control then over that balance and over that release, and that's what makes them happier?
Absolutely.
Or I shouldn't say happier, but that's what helps them to seek that.
Yeah, they start searching for it. They search for the balance. So if you get out of, as we say, the signal is some type of disruption of balance. We disrupt the balance, and they'll start looking for it. But one of the neatest things is they don't look away from you. They look for it under you. And that's a big thing, I believe. What I found is, we used to pull horses away from us or kick them away from us or send them away from us, and they would do stuff. But when you change the balance and that horse turns underneath you and it returns to that balance, it starts to look for that. And so they're always trying to stay under the middle of you. And they turn underneath you, and they don't, you don't get the whiplash or the centrifugal force when they do that on hard turns and hard runs. Okay. And,
so how would you use your seat? Sure.
Take the cow down the hill.
Right. So how would you be using your seat in this to help the horse seek that balance?
Well, seat basically has three positions. There's kind of low and round, when you want to gather a horse into you, and that would be stop. It's kind of like, I would say, it's like trying to put your elbows into your pockets, to your front pockets. You just kind of get round, just like you want your horse to do. You want him to be round and flexible in his back and get heavy and rock into your hips a little bit. Middle of that is neutral, and up, like you're pushing somebody away from you, is go. And so basically you have those three things. Then you can add a little English, left or right, and that tells them, what to do is you get out of their way of their spine. So if you want to turn to the left, move your spine slightly to their right. And where that opens up the bar pad on there, and the horse will come through, and then you get back to the middle. So the other leg can come through, of course. But, you go back to neutral, and it becomes where the reins are really just, all they do is keep the horse from pushing too far forward or getting, they just keep them balanced. That's all they do.
Okay. So low and round. Yeah, right. Well, yeah, and exactly. There's only so much explanation we can give through an audio like this, without having a horse there in front for somebody to see, But so you're talking of three seat positions: low and round, neutral, and up. When would the neutral position be there? Just when you're going with the horse, following the movement he's giving?
If you're in that neutral position, it's the center of your seat and the center of your saddle, and that's why you don't want a saddle that pushes you back on. Like a lot of Western riders, they say sit on your pockets. Well, then you got to kick it every step. We want to be in the center of our seat, and so where the horse can move you, and so you're like in the center of a scale, if you will.
Okay.
The horse is moving you, so you're in perfect time because he's moving you to that time. If you're in the very center, the seam of your pants, basically, with your heels underneath your hips and your shoulders, a good riding position, not with your feet kicked out in front of you and your butt sitting down like you're sitting, the riding position. Mm-hmm. And I would call it more of a classical seat.
Yes.
And if you look at the old California saddles, they were real flat in the middle, high in the front and back, but flat in the middle. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of just how they rode. And we try to do that what got me on, it changed my feet a lot, because I've gotten into really fat horse and ring and, sit on your pockets, but you have to push them every step,
Mm.
And so what I want to do is engagement without force. And so if you get in the middle, you can engage that horse a lot more with a lot more passivity. The flow is better. And so, that's one of the things that I really work on is creating collection without creating tension. And so if you're in the right place, if you're sitting and pushing, you've got to use a lot of tension because you're blocking half the movement anyway.
Sure. So you want to be in the easiest place for the horse to carry you, basically.
Yeah, and where his movement is going to tie your seat, and then then all the when you pick him is pretty simple because he's moving you, so you can pick him in that motion.
Okay.
When you pick, I say pick when you change something. When you signal.
Okay. So what would you say that you look for in a horse? And I guess first I would say, would you say that there's maybe a horse that's better to be a hackamore horse or a two-rein horse or a bridle horse? Or do you think that you're going to kind of take all of them the whole way through this system?
I think horses that are tend to be a little more upright, uphill built, seem to be a little easier to bring to the system. But mostly it's, horses that are just willing. I like a horse that's just got a kind eye and just a nice horse. Got decent conformation. It's athletic, but specifically, we ride everything. I have some Spanish horses, and I really like those because I got into some of the Andalusians and Azteca, and I got into those because I wanted to see, kind of how the system was developed on Spanish horses. And so, early California horses were Spanish horses. And it really hits home with them. But almost every other horse that we've ridden in our workshops, it does relate to them very well. Because I think all horses want to be in balance.
Mm-hmm.
It's how much collection, you want to think about. Does that horse have a strong enough hind end to really drive and to support that? I tend to like horses that stop pretty hard, so I like them with a low tail set.
Okay.
Big hip, big strong hip.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there's any. It's like anything, if you go through the process and you help the horse along, they change. A horse that is developed, it's just like, you take an athlete and you give it specific exercises for whatever event it's going to participate in. And that horse's body or that person's body is going to change and develop. It's just knowing what you want and figuring out exercises that are going to enhance that.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
I guess in dressage they call it, gymnastics.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So let's say we've got a horse then that is just really downhill built. Like I'm going to say some of the modern Western pleasure horse. Maybe I'll send that out there. Those horses by nature and by the design of their body, for the most part, are arguably downhill enough that they may never be able to reach an actual state of collection in the way that we talk about balance, but we could get them closer to a balanced state.
Yeah, I think once they figured out that, it's like a lot of horses are like me going to the gym You know, I don't want to do it.
Okay.
I just do not want to work out and stuff. But I figure out when I am in better shape, things get easier. And so when that horse figures out that, you know, if it packs a little more weight on its hind end and it engages that hind end more, he finds that life is a lot easier. He becomes happier. You know, it's just like anybody. If you walk around with your head down, you know, you're not going to be a very bright and energetic person. And so, you know, those horses, once they figure out, you know, that they move easier, you know, it's the same reason they teach armies to march, you know, is that when they get their chest up and they start to reach with their feet, everything, it becomes easier. They can do more and withstand it. So it's one of those things. They don't necessarily like it in the beginning. They have to be taught in a slow progression. You know, a lot of people think, you know, that a headset is collection.
Right.
And I think anybody that's really well educated on horses understands that, no, the headset is the product of collection. A good headset is the product of collection, not the other way around.
Right.
You know, and that's, I think, you know, one of the things is people get worrying about setting that head before they bring the hind end to driving and reaching forward. And if they quit worrying about that and get the rest of the horse set up for it, that chin's going to drop off, and they're going to be able to collect and do what everybody says, ride them from back to front.
Yeah, right. So when the haunches are right and the back is right, basically the neck will take care of itself.
Yeah.
Within reason, of course.
Yeah. And so, you know, yeah, I think there's degrees. I think there's horses that you're probably going to start out and you're going to create a lot more work than maybe if you'd have found one that was a little closer to your ideal. I take one, you know, when I look at colts, I just take one, I look at it, and I look at it when it moves in its own collection. You know, horses will collect up when they play with another horse or when they're doing something on their own. And I look at that and I go, yeah, that's kind of the picture I like, and that's the horse I pick.
So you want to see one going around that's about as close to what you want the finished picture to look like when he's without you, so that you can create that when he's with you.
Yeah, I think that if it's there, you know, you see young horses and you go, yeah, that horse moves the way that, you know, it's my picture in my head. So, you know, and that's, I guess it just depends on the individual picture. I think that it is an art. And so I know the picture I want to create. And so when I have an ideal look, that's what I want to do. And I think that's, you know, up to the individual a lot. I don't like to put this, you know, cookie cutter aspect into it. You know, I think each person, you know, it's like some people, well, you can't go in a bridle because your horse is not doing flying leads or something. Well, maybe that person never wants to. Maybe they just want to ride on around on the trail, have a nice horse that has a little gather to it and looks good. You know, that's more power to them.
Gotcha. Yeah, if that's what they're looking for, then why would it be wrong by anybody's standards?
Right. If they're enjoying their horse and, you know, they like what they're doing, their horse is happy, then I see no fault in it.
Awesome. Well, that brings me to another question that I had here. When you talk about this system was designed by riders that were, you know, at least theoretically riding their horses 10 to 12 hours or more a day, getting a job done, covering lots of country, that sort of stuff. I think it's realistic for us to say that that's not the case with most modern riders. They're, you know, riding their horse after they get out of the office and in between taking the kids to soccer and cheerleading and dance and things like that. And, you know, of course, there's people that are riding their horses more than that, but most of us are with fixed schedules that we're not riding our horses 10 to 12 hours a day. And covering lots of ground. So is this a system that we would maybe say then is not suitable for those riders, or is there a way that they can adapt and still think about this balance even though they've not got that long a time or that much of a job to do with their horse?
I think it's very suitable, you know, because it really does relate to the horse. That's what I love about it, is that you can get on and it doesn't take a lot of drilling or training. If you find the balances in the equipment and in yourself. I mean, you can do it for 20, 30 minutes. It's actually better, you know, anytime you build a collection is to not go very long, you know. And in the beginning, you know, being a dressage rider and stuff, you know, you build collection moments at a time.
Yes.
And over a long period of time. And, you know, that, so, you know, if a person rides a half hour, an hour, or something like that, no, it's a really neat system for that. In that horses stay, for me, having done a lot of different stuff, it's just they stay happy. They enjoy their work, and, you know, they come to the gate every day and meet them. And so for me, that's one of the biggest aspects of it, and why, you know, I decided to share it. You know, I didn't want to do workshops or clinics, you know, at first, but people kept saying, you know, you got to teach this. And I was like, well, you know, I didn't invent any of this stuff. I just looked at all the equipment, and I got to a point where I just reverse engineered everything. And so then I adjusted my riding to the parameters that this equipment worked. And when I did that, my horses got a lot better.
Gotcha. So that's going to take me to a question of choosing good equipment. How do you go about, let's take it apart piece by piece. How would you go about picking a good hackamore?
Well, a good hackamore generally, you know, is as a rawhide core. It's not cable or it's well braided.
You don't want to use one of those big honking steel nose bands I saw hanging on a tack shop wall?
No. Find it something, you know, it's finely braided. I recommend people use, you know, latigo or rawhide at first. You don't want to scuff a horse up. You know, I see a lot of people riding hackamores and they've got their jaws scuffed up and stuff. That's not necessary, and it's not a good practice. You know, it happens to the best of us occasionally, you know, if you get out and a bunch of calves are running back or something. But, you know, generally you want something that's pliable enough. I always say when people are learning, use something that's not too abrupt.
Yes.
And so, you know, if they do tend to hold on them, the worst thing you can do on a hackamore horse is hold it. It's a movement, and it's a lift and release. It's never a pull, steady kind of an operation, because they just get really dull. So I say use something soft, latigo. You know, it can have a rawhide nose button, because that's another thing with a hackamore. It's a lift. All this system is lifting up. None of it's pulling back. You know, whether you're using a bridle or a hackamore, it's a lift system. And the reason is, you know, your horn is one of your biggest tools to go around with your dallies. And so if you're pulling back, you're covering, you know, your horn.
Yeah.
So everything's designed to lift. And that's one of the things that got me off the snaffle bit. You couldn't really use it effectively how it's designed to be used, one-handed or high-handed. And where most people say, you know, use low hands, well, that doesn't really make any difference to a hackamore. The more lift you got, the better it works. So, but anyway, soft is a good way to start. You know, there's a lot of quality makers out there. Find something that feels pretty good. Generally 5/8, you know, it depends on what you're doing. If you're starting a horse, most of our horses now are pretty nice horses. They're not the old coarse horses, so you don't need a 3/4 or anything like that. 5/8 usually works fine. And you go have that, maybe a 1/2 inch and a 3/8 for your under bridle. And, you know, and once that horse learns to work a little bit, you can go to a hackamore with a little more body, a little more feel to it, because he'll know how to work, and so he'll be able to stay in that without getting, you know, your hands getting too abrupt.
Okay.
Because it's just like you or I. If somebody jerks on us or something, the first thing we're going to do is tense up.
Yes.
And I don't want my horse to tense up. I want it to relax into the feel. to soften into the feel, not to be afraid of it. And so, you don't want something that feels like a stick.
Gotcha. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
They sell stick horses at Tractor Supply. We can go there if we want one of those.
Yeah. But, so, and that's something, it's hard to describe, just a good feeling Hackamore. There's several guys that build them.
Mm-hmm.
From there, you have a small Bosalito, we call it, that we use as a two-rein, and it's the same thing. It's just smaller, and so it'll use under the bridle. The bridles, there's several people making them. What you want is a good balance. When you hold that bit in the palm of your hand and move it back and forth, it won't move a lot. I use just Santa Barbara cheeks because they have that counterbalance, that bell.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And they're very, very steady neutral position. You can move your hand up and down, and that mouthpiece will not move unless you engage it. And the angle that mouthpiece sets as it sits in your palm, it'll have a neutral position. And I pick one that is laid back, so it doesn't sit at vertical. You don't want your horse at vertical all the time. What you want to do is, if you engage that bridle, if you pick up on it, it may go to vertical, but you don't want it at vertical, because when you engage it, it'll take the horse behind vertical.
Gotcha, yes.
He's really following that mouthpiece. So you want something just ahead of vertical. That's kind of how your horse packs itself, when it's working.
Gotcha. So depending on your horse's natural head carriage, say you've got one that wants to nose out a bit more, would you be looking for a bit that would, in its neutral angle, match maybe we could call it the neutral angle of your horse's head while he's going?
A little more laid back, yeah.
Okay.
And that, if he was developed well in the Hackamore, he should develop, it's the natural carriage after you complete the Hackamore process. You wouldn't take them before you were started and go. Unless you were looking at them as a baby, they all kind of carry themselves pretty right.
Yeah.
But, through the Hackamore process, once he's learned to kind of use his hind end and stuff, then you'd look at him and evaluate that. Yeah, and you'd have one that tips back, what they call lays back a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of, horses I ride, we've had a lot of, cut and bred horses, stock bar horses and stuff. Okay. And they tend to run a little flatter, especially when they're working cattle, they'll tend to get a little flat on you. Mm-hmm. And, we'd have one that's a little more laid back for those guys. And that works. It seems to work really well.
Gotcha. Okay. Great. Now, what about this idea of a half breed? Can you tell our listeners what that half breed is and what you would look for with that? Or would you even be interested in using that in this system?
A lot of people do. I don't really agree with the, in the new system, the newer type system, a lot of people go to a half breed and then to the spade. Well, the half breed is a very quick bit. It doesn't have braces, so it doesn't have anything to slow that rotation down. And basically, it's just a straight bar with a staple in the center of it, a tall, narrow mouthpiece with a roller. Okay. And so it's a pretty quick bit. And you didn't really see a lot of those in my research. You didn't see a ton of them before, World War I. And I think what happened is a lot of guys came back, and this California system was the whole western slope of the Rockies at one point. Even in Montana, if you look at Charlie Russell paintings, they're all spade bit guys from California brands. But I think when they came back from the war, there was a lot of older horses, and they needed something they didn't use a lot of snaffle bits. There was not a lot of snaffle bits used in this country at that time. And I think they needed something that they could grab a hold of, and maybe even one rein, a bridle. And so they could do that in a half breed, and they couldn't do that in the spade. And I think that's where it became more popular. and that's just one of those things. As you see that after World War One, then you got the Depression in Oklahoma, people coming up here, and those things became more prevalent, and a lot of the California stuff started fading out. And a lot of that whole thing about a spade bit being real severe. Well, if you see a guy and his horse is spinning and sliding and stuff, and he's moving his hand in a 2-inch square, and you come from a pressure-based system, you're probably going to think that bit's real severe.
Yeah, it'd be easy to misunderstand that.
Yeah, it would be easy to misunderstand if that's what you're used to working off of.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's not really part of the system for what I do. I find that I would have to, there's signal in a half breed, but I would have to be so much more careful and so much more precise with my hand to use the signal in it before it engaged. Because it's quick to lever.
Yes, gotcha. Because there's less surface area to stop the rotation.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's just not as much to stop the rotation, and there's not as much signal. The braces do create a bit of signal, but mostly they're for that horse to protect itself.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Looking over my questions here. So you were talking about the snaffle bits, and you said in the classical system we don't see the use of the snaffle bits like we seem to do with a lot of guys now, snaffle bit then hackamore. And it sounds like you've done a lot of research. Do you have any idea as to when the snaffle bit kind of came onto the scene and how that got involved?
Well, I think it came in with the Anglo coming into Spanish California, an influx of them, a great deal of them during the gold rush, and a little bit prior to that, they came in here and started acquiring land and things. And, most of them were teamster based. They didn't even have a lot of carriages and stuff in California. They had ox carts for traveling. So they were not driving people, and I think when the driving people came into California, that started becoming more prevalent. But there was still a lot of just true diehard hackamore people and stuff until, the 70s. It changed a lot when a lot of the people got together and they decided, we need to be able to make money on these horses faster, and they created the futurities.
Yeah.
And so we need to, get these horses in at 2 and train them and then show them at 3. Well, then that snaffle became a lot more prevalent. I think it also took a hold in the Great Basin a lot more too, is because a lot of, real fresh, snotty horses, and, they were easier to get by in a snaffle bit.
Gotcha.
Than they are hackamore. They didn't take the time to train them like they did earlier in California.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, would you say that with the rein leathers or the slobber straps on a snaffle bit, would you say that it's possible to ride a horse in the snaffle bit thinking about that balance and that signal that you talk about?
I think you can. I think a seat, your seat signal, it's the biggest influence on a Western horse anyway, right? I mean, you look at a Western tree, and it's got 4 bar pads. And so if you can influence those bar pads to create signal, real easy to open doors and close doors. So, yeah, I think it is. I don't think it has a neutral position. It just kind of hangs there. The horse hangs his head right. The problem I see with it, why I don't, subscribe to it anymore. And I mean, I've shown them this now 53, so it's not like I'm foreign to them.
Right.
But it's just the fact that it's not consistent to the bridle. The hackamore and the bridle work almost exactly the same. They work on the reins underneath, and they can't be twisted too much, and so they're very, very consistent from one to the next. Where a snaffle bit works on the side of the face, and it does not work very well lifting, right? Because as soon as you lift it up, you're going to get into the teeth, because the only thing protecting the teeth is the lips of the horse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's why you have to have low hands with the snaffle bit, so you can stay in that dental groove. And when you lift up on it, it tends to get into the teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And so that just didn't make sense to me, and really got me studying that. And then I found out, you know, I thought I needed one to create different things, but, you know, if your horse is good in the body and has flexion, you can create flexion and any kind of a shape in the horse. You need something that he respects on his head, not some specific piece of equipment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's just about the consistency from one to the next, because my horses are destined to be bridle horses. That's all I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more of the thing. But I think, yeah, there's guys that ride them very well.
Yeah, but it's interesting that talking about the lifting of the hands, because in the classical dressage system, you know, we talk about the boucher flexions, where there is an elevation of the hands to achieve the flexions of the jaw, the releasing of the jaw and the releasing of the top line. And interestingly enough, when you ride a horse with the boucher style flexions in mind, with that elevation, you're teaching the horse to kind of lift at the base of the neck through the contact on the lips of the snaffle bit. And very much from what I've seen and experienced myself with riding in the hackamore and with playing with the idea of the boucher flexions, they start to carry themselves in a very similar balance. So it is very interesting how then the classical side of both ends of that, you know, the classical Western, as we could call it, and the classical dressage are looking for that same carriage, that same balance that we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the horse is the handiest.
Yes, exactly.
You know, I mean,
exactly, right.
That's all. Yeah, I think that's all, you know, dressage has become a thing, but originally it was just to have a really handy horse that you could move and not get stabbed at.
Right, and so much of it came from the same horses, right? You know, so much of it came from the conquistadors, the Spanish and the Portuguese riders, the bullfighters, and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, that all comes, you know, the Spanish riding school in Vienna. You know, they don't call it Spanish riding school for nothing. It's, you know, it's based on
right.
It's based on that, and I did a lot of study on that when I was trying to re-educate myself to learning the system better. I read a lot of that stuff because that's what's written. There's not much written about this style, you know, that's real accurate or easy to digest. And that there's some really good stuff